My name is Jeff. I'm going to talk to you for a bit about interoperability testing. I actually gave this presentation last year, so this is the second time I'm doing it. I test IP security over in Windows SE. So we'll get right to it. The stuff that I'm going to go over is kind of give you an idea of what interoperability is, why interoperability is one of the buckets that we have for testing. I mean, obviously, if it's one of the buckets we focus on, it's got to be important. So I'm going to go over a little of a background about why it's important. I'm going to give you an idea of kind of some pointers on how we do interoperability testing, what things to look for when you're trying to come up with interoperability test cases, that sort of thing. And finally, we'll have a Q&A period. Stuff I'm not going to do, I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of detail. The scope, like any other bucket, the scope of the problem is just too broad to cover in a 15, 20, 30-minute period. Hopefully what you will come away from this presentation with is some good ideas and some, hopefully you'll kind of be started on the road towards understanding interoperability and being able to do interop testing. So moving right along, interoperability happens whenever we have two different things that have to work together. In the Windows world, we're mostly going to be focused on interoperability between operating systems and interoperability within the operating system. We could have interoperability between different types of operating systems. So we could have Windows working with Linux. We could have different interoperability between different OS versions. What happens when Windows XP tries to talk to Windows 98? What happens when a Windows 98 machine needs to get a file off of a Windows XP machine? We also have interop test cases between different OS revisions. XPSP1 and XPSP2 are different. There's a whole just huge amount of change that happened in that revision, and we have to do interop testing to make sure that that revision didn't break interoperability with the previous OSs. And then there's also interoperability between protocols. In an ideal world, no one would have to worry about this, but of course, every vendor implements protocols differently. There's questions about how we interpret RFCs, so we have to make sure that we do verify interop between protocols. Now, in the Windows SE world, we're going to kind of be focused on the number 3.1, what happens between different OS revisions. In developing the core operating system, the core Windows teams have kind of verified a lot of the other ones. They've made sure that the Windows networking works with Cisco networking. They've made sure that Windows XP and Windows Server 2003 work with Windows 98. So what we really need to be focused on is when we build Service Pack 2 for Windows XP, or when we release GDRs for Windows XP or Windows 2000, that we don't break the previous versions of the operating system. Now, the reason this is important is first, it's a matter of customer perception. Our customers don't have very much patience when things break. Microsoft has, deservedly or not, we have a reputation that we've been fixing, but there's this perception that Microsoft software is not secure. There was a perception for a long time that Microsoft software is not stable. And then there's a perception that Microsoft doesn't play fair. If we break interoperability, people are going to assume the worst. I remember kind of back when I was first starting to work here, we did NT4 SP6, and SP6 actually broke the Lotus email application, and there was a whole lot of bad press, and there were people who speculated that we did this on purpose. And this is a huge PR hit for Microsoft. So even if it's an innocent bug, people are going to assume the worst about it. So if interop breaks and all of a sudden Microsoft doesn't, Windows doesn't work with Linux, or Windows doesn't work with previous versions of Windows, people are going to assume bad things about us. It's going to be a big PR hit, and our customers aren't going to be happy. The next reason that interop is important is because our customers don't run homogeneous environments. When we do a lot of our regression testing, like when I test my IPsec driver, it's a 5-machine setup, and all 5 machines are essentially the same. They're all running Windows XP, they're all running the same service pack build, and they're even the same hardware. Now, this is fine. We're all I'm trying to do is regression test my IPsec driver, but in terms of a real-world scenario, this isn't how things work in the real world. If you visit any one of our customers, you're going to find a hugely mixed environment. You're going to find tons of different OSs. You're going to find they're going to have 3 different OS revisions. They're going to be in the middle of rolling out 2 different service packs and a bunch of different GDRs that they haven't gotten done. They're still, in many cases, going to be running NT4 on servers. They're going to be running Windows 9X and Windows 2000 on their clients. Our customers don't have homogeneous environments, and when they do roll things out, they do it in phases. They don't roll it all out at once. So we can't simply assume from a testing perspective that our customers are going to have one thing, that we only have to worry about that one thing, because it just ain't true. Because of this, because of these phase rollouts and these mixed environments, there's a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong. 10 years ago, we didn't have to worry about this. 15 years ago, so much, because computers mostly worked on their own. We mostly traded. Most communication happened by putting a file on a floppy disk. Maybe add some email, but for the most part, computers were standalone things. Now they're not anymore. The network is really the focus. It's really the focus of our customer environments, and you have a whole bunch of computers that are trying to work together. So there's just a lot of opportunity for things to go wrong, which is why we make interop one of the buckets that we cover, one of the areas that we focus on. Customers don't like to roll things out to begin with. It costs them money and it costs them pain. Whenever we release a new patch, whenever we release a new service pack, our customers are not happy. They don't like doing this. They see it as kind of a necessary evil. So the fact that they don't want to really install our service pack or our GDRs in the first place, if those GDRs then are no good, if they break interop, or if they break anything else, our customers are going to be just doubly unhappy. So this is why it's really crucial that we make sure that we don't break this bucket. So interop's a big area. That's the bad news. It's a huge area, and it involves not only Microsoft products, but it involves tons of other products. I kind of come from the networking world, which is why I keep using networking examples, but in the networking world, we've got different types of routers we have to worry about. We have different OSs that we network with. Now, the good news is that the core Windows group has already done a lot of the work when they developed the core operating system. They've already done, the work in my IPsec component, they've already done the work of making sure that IPsec plays well with Cisco routers, and that Cisco's IPsec implementation works with our IPsec implementation. They've already done the work of verifying that Windows IPsec and Solaris IPsec can work together. So the good news is we don't really have to focus on that so much. The area that we do want to focus on is the stuff that we actually play with, which is the different OS revisions. The big things we're going to be focusing on is different versions, XP1, SP2. What we want to make sure is that from one version to the next, we don't break things. So that's going to be the first thing we're going to be focusing on, or that you're going to want to focus on in your interop testing, is how does it play with previous revisions of the operating system. Or if you're doing GDRs, how does it work with machines that may not have the GDRs installed, or may have a different set of GDRs installed. A couple of areas that you're going to want to identify when you're doing interop testing is pretty much the way things, the protocols and the methods, the components within the OS and components between OSs will use to talk to one another. Big one's going to be network protocols. Using, once again, my component as an example in IP security, what I was mentioning before we had those problems was with Windows XP SP2, we've done a lot of security hardening and a lot of tightening of the operating system. One of the things we've done is we've turned the firewall on by default with SP2, and we've really tightened it down. Other things we've done, we've locked down RPC calls. We've shut down a lot of remote RPC calls because we identified them as being security risks. So as part of our XP SP2 testing, we've had to really kind of sit down and think hard about how are things going to be affected by the firewall blocking our traffic? How are things going to be affected by these RPC calls no longer being implemented? And it kind of involves thinking a little bit outside the box. You kind of have to not only wonder within your component, but you've got to wonder who else might conceivably be using these calls, who else might conceivably be accessing these resources that are no longer going to be available, and how might our customers perceive that? One thing that's kind of interesting is that interop almost touches upon application testing, in that the two are somewhat similar in the techniques that they employ in terms of identifying what might cause a problem. Well, that's about my presentation. Like I said, I'm just trying to give you a good idea to kind of start you down the path towards thinking about interop testing. If you want a good resource, there's the book Testing Computer Software, which is just an excellent book on just general testing resources, but that'll have a lot more information about interop testing. Is there any questions?
You say you test only the OS revisions between SP1 and SP2, but you still need to test the latest SP2 with different OSs and different versions of them.
Sorry, go ahead.
Will it create a problem if you don't do extensive testing?
The question is that I said that we focus on testing the different OS versions from like XP, SP1 to SP2, and want to cause a problem if we don't do some testing with other stuff like the different OSs and whatnot. And the answer is yes, we do have to do some testing with different OSs, but just in terms of our resources, we have to kind of prioritize based on our experience and just what resources we have at hand. So the priority is going to be testing between different OS revisions. A lot of components will do some sanity. Like I don't have a Cisco router in my lab, but I do once a milestone go head over to the core team's lab, borrow their Cisco router for a day, and just run some test cases against it. But I don't do nearly the kind of extensive interop testing with with that router that I do with the different OS versions. Anyone else? Okay then. Thanks for being here. I hope you guys have a good idea of how to do interop testing now, or at least you kind of have started down that path towards that understanding. And I guess we'll go for the next presentation.